Great. I can see that we've got a good number of you in there now, so we might as well get started. So welcome to this webinar on the World Rugby and Rassie Erasmus and SA Rugby misconduct case, which is co-hosted by Morgan Sports Law and 2 Temple Gardens. The plan is to speak for about an hour or so this morning, and we very much invite you as the attendees to submit your questions, if you have any, to the panel by the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to answer some of them as we go along, but we'll also make some time at the end to go through any that we haven't answered. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben Cisneros. I'm a trainee solicitor at Morgan Sports Law and the founder of the website Rugby and the Law. I'll be co-hosting this session along with my colleague, Stephen Flynn. Steve is a barrister at 2 Temple Gardens and is ranked as one of the top sports law juniors in the UK. Steve and I are delighted to be joined this morning by 3 fantastic guests, Steve Diamond, Matthew O'Grady, and Chris Jones. Steve Diamond is a professional rugby consultant, most well known for his time as Director of Rugby at Sale Sharks, where he was in post for over 8 years until the end of last year. Steve is now lead rugby consultant at Worcester Warriors. Matthew O'Grady is a barrister at St Mary's Chambers, where he practices family and sports law. Matthew is a former Premiership rugby referee and now sits as a judicial officer for the RFU, EPCR and Rugby Europe, where he's chair of the disciplinary committee. And last but by no means least, Chris Jones is the BBC's rugby union correspondent. Chris has covered rugby for the BBC for over 14 years and will be well known to those of you who listen to BBC Radio 5 Live and of course its Rugby Union Weekly podcast. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Hi, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Morning.
Well, before we get into the discussion, I thought it would first be worth just very briefly giving an overview of the case and the decision for those of you who may not yet have read it. Well, the case, of course, relates to the video of South Africa's Director of Rugby, Rassie Erasmus, that went viral in the week after the first test of this summer's Lions tour. Now, the 62-minute long video was a monologue by Erasmus criticising the refereeing of the first test to an unprecedented degree. World Rugby charged Erasmus and his employers, SA Rugby, with misconduct under its regulations, and following a hearing by an independent disciplinary committee led by Christopher Quinlan QC, he was last week banned for 2 months from all rugby activities, including his administrative duties, and for approximately 10 months from all matchday activities. SA Rugby, for its part, was fined £25,000, and both were ordered to apologise to the first test match officials. The panel found 6 charges against Erasmus proven, which included threatening the referee with publishing a viral video criticising his performance, abusing, insulting, attacking and disrespecting the match officials, undermining their integrity, and bringing the game into disrepute. SA Rugby was held liable for failing to ensure that Erasmus complied with the World Rugby Regulations. Interestingly, both Erasmus and SA Rugby denied all of the charges against them and are yet to apologise for their actions. They've also publicly confirmed that they will be appealing the decision. The decision contains a number of very interesting points, many of which I'm sure we'll get into, and important guidance for coaches, players, clubs, governing bodies, and their representatives on what misconduct is and on the relationship between coaches and referees. So, gentlemen, I'll come to you just to ask for a very brief first reaction to the decision in the case. Matthew, if I could perhaps start with you.
I think probably 2 things stood out for me, Ben. First was the detail and the analysis by what was a very experienced panel in both the liability element, the factual side, and in the sanctioning process. And secondly, probably the part that's most captured the press is the human element in Nick Berry's evidence that was reported within the decision.
Chris, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think it's such an interesting case because it's so unprecedented. People have sort of distilled it down a little bit to going, especially the supporters of Erasmus, to saying, oh, Erasmus made a video. But I think what you see and why the hearing and judgment took so long to come out was that it was a lot more than the video. There were many things going on behind the scenes. It'd be fascinating to get Steve's insight through the next hour about how much contact does go on between referees and coaches, because you've got to remember Nick Berry was running the line in test 2 and test 3, so it's raised such a an interesting debate about how much contact there should be between rugby coaches and referees in the middle of a series, and should referees be able to go outside of the process to contact the referee directly, because there was a lot of that was going on outside the actual video. And I think there was a really telling point in the judgment that said, look, critique and chat about referees is kind of part and parcel, from a media point of view. That's all part of the narrative before games and after games, but there's also a line, and most people I think are aware that through the course of this, Erasmus did cross that line.
And Steve Diamond, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, we got to look at the Lions series as absolutely unique, and they come across every 4 years, every 12 years to these countries. And the things that it's an event that should be held in the highest esteem. And I think it was an attempt really to downplay that unique event and to gain an advantage, and that was a disappointing thing for me. I think there are many ways, as we will discuss, that you can be constructive and dignified in the way you talk to referees. And I can say, and people who are watching this will know of my past record, and it's not flash, but there's ways of doing things. And I think if you're at the top of the game, you are a role model, and you've got to deliver with that. And I think on this occasion, South Africa and Rassie didn't do that. So very disappointing for me. Steve,
Flynn, is there anything you wanted to say?
I think the two things I was surprised at, very loyally points, was how aggressive a line of defence Rassie Erasmus took in terms of the case he advanced. And the other one, very much to Matt's point earlier, was in relation to the decision. It's a very accessible decision, which is a hard thing to write that can be easily understood by non-lawyers. So anybody who's involved in the game and touches upon what they do will find it easy to get into, and I encourage them to read it in that regard.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with all those points. And would add that I think, the case provides some interesting guidance, some interesting and important guidance on what misconduct is and when it will arise. And that's something that all unions, clubs, coaches, players and their representatives would be well advised to read. So to move on then a little bit and talk about these interactions that there are between referees and coaches. Steve, you mentioned it in your answer there. Could you perhaps give us a little bit of insight into how that's worked in your experience, and perhaps whether these sorts of videos are something that are commonplace, normally behind closed doors, of course?
Yeah, well, domestically, they were prevalent up till about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, where a coach from one side would put together some clips of the opposition, and let's say it'd be technical offences, pulling down at the scrum, line out offences, stuff that you can't see in the naked eye. It happens that quick, and they would be sent over through the analysis departments of each club to the head of the referees, Tony Spreadbury. He would then have a look at it and send you some feedback, and also give the referee some feedback on that. But it got crazy 4 or 5 years ago, where the analysts in clubs were spending more time analysing the bloody referee than they were on the opposition or their own team's mistakes. So it was decided in the UK that we'd cut them down, and whatever video was sent in, it would be immediately sent to the opposition coach or director of rugby, so he could see what points were being made. Now, at the international stage, I've only coached Russia, which were a second-tier nation, for 3 years. And in those days, which is 11, 12 years ago, we would do something similar. You would say what Georgia are trying to do, what Romania are trying to do, and you get some feedback. But I think the higher up the level you go, the more pressure comes into the game, and these contacts with the referees become more prevalent. I think each of the internationals to this day, South Africa versus England at weekend, a couple of days before the game, the directors of rugby and the coaches have a chance to meet with the referee to discuss various elements of that. It could be as basic as England come offside quickly from short lineouts, that sort of rhetoric. And the referee can understand that, take it, but he also has the right to to speak to South Africa and say what England have said. So there is a lot goes on behind the scenes, and generally it's in a positive way from my experience.
Well, Matt, on that point, are they received in a positive way by the referee in your experience?
It's actually, Steve probably agree with me. There's kind of two different types of interaction. We get the interaction before the game that Steve's described there, and I think Steve's described it really well. That so far as domestically is concerned, Tony Spreadbury has supported the professional group of referees really well by kind of filtering that process and talking about the points that don't need to be do need to be spoken about and those that don't need to be spoken about, because what you've got to remember is referees are doing their own analysis before the games themselves. And in my experience, it's pretty uncommon that a director of rugby is going to give you a point that you haven't already considered in your own analysis of the two sides. So you've got those pre-match points that referees are discussing with their own coaches anyway, and then there's the post-match conversations and the post-match clips, which what Erasmus kind of engaged with here. And there was for the professional referees, every Monday they're doing their own analysis of the game with their coach. I hope the experience of most of the directors of rugby in the domestic professional game is that they're pretty honest and robust analysis. That there may well be times when reasonable people can disagree on something, but at the same time, the coaches, the DORs are feeding back to spreaders, feeding back to the referees' coaches on points that they think need to be covered out of the game. And again, it's pretty rare that referees aren't themselves identifying points in their own analysis where they might have, they could have made a better decision, or they might have made a decision they didn't do. And I think actually when you look at the chronology and the analysis that's attached to the back of the decision, you're seeing some of that. You're seeing Nick Berry's own analysis where he's responding to some of Erasmus's points, and he's saying, actually, yeah, that's a fair point, or I don't agree with that. So I think there's a pretty there's a pretty honest engagement personally by the referees, and it's well managed, I think, externally with directors of rugby still.
I'm guessing the videos aren't anywhere near the production values that Erasmus's was, were they?
Well, I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen anything where a director of rugby sits in front of a camera and talks through issues. My experience is, if you get anything, you might get a minute-long clip showing 5 scrums, and they might highlight the tight head, and they might have a little caption at the bottom. I've never seen anything like what Erasmus did in this.
And to be fair, he must have a lot of time on his hands to do that, because in the day-to-day, you don't have that sort of exposure. And I think the other important thing is what we're trying to do is not, or what I try to do, and I can only speak for myself, but generally the lads across the board who do these jobs are similar. Everybody talks about consistency, and certainly with refereeing decisions, and sometimes they don't look at themselves and they don't look at their own team, because if they put the same pressure on the referees as they would do on the same team post game, what would be the reaction there? So the post analysis is totally different than the preview, as Matt explains there. For example, I can say now 3 times that I've been before the judicial panels, and it's spur of the moment, microphone stuck in front of you after a loss or a win. And that emotion is with you. Well, what has happened here with the length of this video, it must have took 2 or 3 days to edit it. It's then predetermined what they're trying to do is question the integrity of the guy, the referee. And I've never seen that before. And hopefully we won't see that again publicly.
Chris, part of your role is to help with the fans' understanding of the match and what's going to happen on match day. Do you think it would be good if the media could get to see those comments and those feedback so as to help understanding of what's happening and what thoughts are?
Yeah, difficult one. I mean, I think in general, and it's what's difficult is we're all talking largely from an English or a British or a UK rugby perspective, and from a Premiership rugby, they're all under the RFU umbrella. They all work together. They're all aligned. They're all employed by the same people. When you get matches like British and Irish Lions tour, even Six Nations, but on a World Rugby stage, you're getting coaches, referees from different hemispheres, different unions, different leagues, and you therefore get a slight difference in interpretation with all kinds of different issues. But from a Premiership point of view, I think the transparency is reasonably good. I think if the media wanted to go in and watch a review session, I know the Telegraph did a piece reasonably recently about that, and they're pretty transparent. I think as always with media when it comes to officials, and I think football really lost its way maybe 5 years ago. And I'm not saying VAR has been the panacea or anything, but there'd be a situation where a team had lost 5-0 and the manager would be asked, "Or what about the decision for the third goal?" And we would get so caught up because from a media point of view, it's often an easy soundbite and an easy headline to talk about the officiating. In rugby, we've got this different situation to football because we're talking about the whole flow of a game and millions of decisions, as opposed to football, which might be 2 or 3 major flashpoints, penalty, no penalty. And that's where Erasmus, I think, he had some proper, very valid gripes about 1 or 2 decisions there, particularly the Hamish Watson non-yellow card for the tip on Willie LaRue. But he's looking a lot of very subjective technical decisions. And I think as media, coaches, players, we've all got a responsibility to the fans to go, look, rugby is so subjective. A lot of these calls could be one way or the other. And you sometimes just have to accept that is the way that cookie is going to crumble on that day, that you might not get the rub of the green at the breakdown. So I think to trying to differentiate between major flashpoints, which as we saw in Cardiff with the Tompkins knock, that was reviewed and still people can't agree. So video is not going to be bring the utopia, but I think it's just acknowledging that trying to take that subjectivity as part of the game, as well as clearly trying to make sure referee standards are high, because I know they set high standards on themselves.
I think that's a really important point, Chris. And just before we move on from the sort of ref coach dynamic, one of the things that was flagged in the decision was a recommendation essentially that these interactions be properly regulated, that there be protocols put in place to deal with them. So a question for Matthew and Steve Diamond, if I may, to what extent are there formal protocols in place now for these pre and post match discussions? And do you think that sort of having stricter or more formal regulation, so to speak, would work in practice?
I think Steve's probably a bit closer to the ground now than I am, so Steve might well be a better place to answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, and I don't want to be critical of World Rugby because they do a fantastic job, but and they are the governing body. So whatever we do in the Premiership cascades down from their decision making at the top. And I think the protocols, certainly in the Premiership, are very good. In Europe, they're very good, very similar. I think they've got experienced referees. They've got Joe Smith working for World Rugby, who are in charge of the rugby per se. And I think what World Rugby sometimes don't reflect is what really goes on at the coalface of the leagues around the world. World Rugby sit there, I wouldn't say in an ivory tower, but I've worked for them for 3 years in my Russian job. And the interaction is nothing like you get with the RFU, for example. The RFU are a proactive organisation who work under the umbrella of World Rugby. So you only see these recommendations when it happens at this level, as in the Lions series or in a World Cup, and which is right, the recommendations are there should be some protocols. But down the line, those protocols, in my opinion, are in place, and the referee departments do a good job, no doubt the same in France, in the Celtic nations, and also in the UK. So I think World Rugby may need to take something which is already in place at a lower level than the internationals, and use those protocols which are time served.
Just 2 things quickly on what Steve said about the interaction between World Rugby and the leagues. I think that's really valid, and there's been a big issue with that because World Rugby's had to go through unions to get to leagues in the past, but now there is a panel being set up where the leagues are directly working with World Rugby, so almost taking out that kind of union filter, which I think could benefit the game on a whole load of levels when it comes to governance and running it. And just on that interaction point, Erasmus in the day after a big test, speaking to a referee who is involved in the officiating team for test 2 and 3. I just wonder what the Lions' reaction would have been if it had come out that Erasmus and Nick Berry were communicating outside official channels. I think they could have, understandably perhaps been held to pay. So I think in a series like the Lions is very unique because all eyes of the world are on it and it's different to anything else. But I don't think you can have a situation where one coach can have a hotline to an official and the other coach isn't. I'm not sure if that's a particularly sustainable way of doing things.
Particularly, you'd want something to prevent probably interaction once the series has started, make the points before everything gets started. And so you've got some certainty as to what are going to be looked at, not, but once you're in it, all bets, all contact should be off, is certainly my preliminary view. So in terms of the video, moving on to it, the case was put by World Rugby on the basis that Erasmus had crossed the line. Now, certainly my view is it was apparent from just the video in itself, he had crossed the line to something that rugby as a game would consider unacceptable. What's the view of the panel? If I can start with you, Matt, was that your view as well?
Well, I think my sense about these things is, when you see it. It's like a red card. You know it's a red card when you see it. You've got that feeling. And I think a lot of people looked at this, like you've described, Steve, and thought that's unusual, and it didn't sit comfortably. Whether you overstep the line, if we accept what the committee found as being true, that he made a threat, that he followed upon the threats, that he attacked the referee and disparaged the referee, that he published criticism in breach of contractual obligations with World Rugby, I think I'd have to turn around to the person on the other side and say, how is that not crossing the line that's you've signed up to as part of participating in rugby union and the core values of the game?
Chris, have you got a view?
When you watch the video, there are the technical offences side of things, and there's also the implications of bias and the South Africans being discriminated against. And you feel, because it was quite calculated, Erasmus put out a few tweets, didn't he, saying, it's all part of the game, you win some, you lose some. And then days later, this video drops, which implies that it was a big trump card he's playing because he could feel this series may have been slipping away unless he did something. Now, I don't think any of us feel Nick Berry had an amazing game that day, and I'm sure Nick Berry doesn't feel he had an amazing game that day. But this was South Africa's first game since the World Cup final, a World Cup final where they were so superb, and the whole rugby world was falling over themselves to praise the box, to praise Siya Kolisi. They themselves spoke about, or post the World Cup analysis, spoke about how good they were at analysing referees, how Dwayne Vermeulen would be the guy to speak to the ref. Kolisi would come in with the key points, and the way they managed the ref, the way they had Bongi Mbonambi talking about Jerome Garces's physical appearance. They were the past masters at working with referees. So for the next game after that, there to be this huge conspiracy implied against the Springboks, I think we all stopped and thought, well, hold on, the last time they played, they were absolutely outstanding in all facets, including managing the referee. And so that's where I think Erasmus quite clearly, according to the panel, crossed the line. It's one thing to go, we should have had a holding on pen there, or that advantage was too long, or they went into the side. It's another to say our whole team is not being respected in the same way the Lions are. I think that's a stretch given the stature the Springboks had. This was not Lions against a tier 2 team that struggles to be respected. This was the Lions against the world champions. And I think for a lot of people that felt a bit uncomfortable, the way Erasmus was saying that the Springboks were actively being discriminated against.
Steve, given your comments, do you echo those views?
Yeah, I think so. I think, we've not got to forget what a great player and captain of South Africa Erasmus was, and what a brilliant job, as Chris has said, he did in the World Cup final and the World Cup, and bringing the nation together, working with all the problems that they have in South Africa. But notwithstanding that, he's very naive, I think. I think if he thought that video wouldn't go viral, having sent it to his staff, his playing group, without any security on it, then, you know, it's naive beyond belief. And that's why I feel he overstepped the mark. You know, the 1-0 down in a test series, he's come from a very great height of winning the World Cup, which they weren't expected to do, to be fair. And under pressure, people react in strange ways. And his reaction certainly overstepped the mark, in my opinion.
So we're talking a lot about crossing a line here, and Matt sort of put the view that you know crossing the line when you see it. But can we sort of dig into a bit more, you know, where the line is between fair public comment and misconduct? Because, you know, World Rugby accepted in their case, for example, that it is legitimate for coaches to sort of want to, or to try to influence referees through, for example, comments in the media. What do the panel think about that sort of use of the media by coaches? Is it proper? Should it be accepted? I mean, the decision suggests that it is to a degree, but do we think that's right? I mean, Chris, perhaps as someone here sort of representing the media, so to speak, come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, you know, it'd be a bit hypocritical to bite the hand that feeds. And, you know, let's take an example of players, say, look at say Warren Gatland targeting, in inverted commas, Carl Sinclair before the Wales-England game in 2019, said he was a ticking time bomb and they can get under his skin. And Sinclair had a blinder but gave away a few penalties. And we all said, oh, canny stuff from Gatland. Look at Eddie Jones, Reece Patchell, 2018 England-Wales at Twickenham. He said, can he handle the pressure? Has he got the bottle? Patchell struggled a bit. And, oh, look, it's an Eddie Jones mind games masterpiece. So I think this is, and the referees maybe come into that as well. And loads of referees have, it's different in the club game because we don't have as much probably pre-match media as in the big international games. But, you know, I think there is an acceptance that some of this is part and parcel, whether it should be or not. You know, that's a different matter. But I think that there is an acceptance. It is all part of the narrative. You know, is this player going to cope? Is that player going to cope? Is the referee going to cope, etc. But I think because of the extremes to which Erasmus went to, and I know this is the Lions feel that then poisoned the test series and got in the head of the officials for the second test. And that second test went 2 hours and 12 minutes or something absurd, because they looked paralyzed with fear, those officials. Another day, Cheslin Colby gets a red for clattering Conor Murray. Is that playing on their minds? Look, let's get this absolutely right. Let's take more time. The more you look, the more mitigation you can find. So I think that's again where people would feel that Erasmus has gone too far, because it's not post-match or one-off game. This is in the middle of a series that people, especially on the Lions side, then feel had a major impact on the officiating throughout the series and did poison what should have been a great celebration of rugby in the midst of a pandemic. So yeah, I'd probably not help with the question, Ben. I suppose I do agree that we can all accept critique of players and referees up to a point. Anything that goes particularly personal or particularly looks to impair on their objectivity, I think is a different matter.
And Steve Flynn, if I could come to you on that, you know, do you have a view on the extent to which it should be happening?
Well, I think it's inevitable that there's going to be some part of it. To Chris' point, people are going to be interviewed. They're going to say things. To have an arbitrary line that you're not allowed to say anything that impacts on a referee is just impossible to come up with. It'd just be impossible to enforce. And one of the comments made in the decision was that these kind of things are easier to say than define. And I think that must be right. If you're involved in the game, and those who are sitting on these panels are involved in the game and know the game, they will have a feeling for when these lines are crossed and when things are going forward. And I think we have to respect that. So I think to try and come up with a kind of absolute line that you cannot do anything or cannot do this just would be impossible to enforce. So I think it just has to reflect a bit to Chris's point about what goes on in the game. You have to have a feel for the game and a feel for what's going on the pitch. I think you also have to have a feel for what's going on in the media and the way things are developing, and things will change over time.
Yeah, and I agree there. You know, if you think about it, rugby union is an embryonic professional game. It's been going 25 years. It's not like football that's been around for 100+ years. And if you see the change in football, if you see the change in the managers in football from the Mourinho style to Ferguson style, it's changed. You know, the guy at Chelsea doesn't talk about the opposition. Pep Guardiola doesn't talk about the opposition. They never speak about referees. Sometimes we should be learning in rugby, because we do have ourselves up on the pedestal that we do everything right. And there's a lot to be learned from other sports. Certainly, you know, when it comes to the referees, we built the sport over 155, 60 years, whatever it is. And we show the utmost respect to the referee. And, you know, I've been guilty of not doing that. So it's not poacher term gamekeeper. I'm giving you my honest appraisal. But there is a constructive and dignified way of highlighting a referee's performance after the event. You go through the code of conduct. Everybody knows what the code of conduct. We can muddy the waters and say the RFU's code of conduct is different from the French code of conduct. It's not. It all permeates down from World Rugby. And what Rassie's done is gone against that code of conduct. And what I feel World Rugby has done well with the 3 senior people on that panel is come down hard on it, because we don't want that in the game on a regular basis at any level, grassroots, professional level, or even at the elite World Cups and Lions series. So there's a pathway to do it, and he's not gone down that route.
And Steve, do you think directors of rugby, coaches know where the line is?
I think so, Matt. Yeah, I do. And I'm one of the outspoken ones. But since my last offence in 2017, I put all the senior coaches.
I think I remember that one.
Pardon?
I think I remember that one.
Oh, you do, yeah. I put all myself and all the senior coaches and senior players on a refereeing course, a 3-day refereeing course, which was facilitated by the RFU up in the Northwest. And that sort of helped. Plus, I also, if you take the emotion away, which is only an hour after the game, you know, and what a lot of coaches don't do, in my opinion, is it's easy to be critical on review when you can see the event 4 or 5 times. I can honestly tell you here, Spreadbury and that crew, I've known them for donkey's years, and they know I tell the truth about this. When I make a decision about a referee, I see it the same time he sees it. So I don't work on the benefit as a coach of seeing it 4 times later. I go, that's the wrong decision or that's the right decision. And that's how I do my post-match analysis of it, if I do 3 or 4 points. And sometimes I'm wrong, sometimes I'm right. But it is that swing and roundabout effect. Most people, most sensible people realise that the game moved on without the referees 25 years ago. But in the last 10, 15 years, the referees have caught the game up in fitness levels, in professionalism, in their decision-making, in the way they communicate. They've caught us up. The British refs and the Southern Hemisphere refs might have different sort of interpretations of a ruck or the speed of a ruck, but really, they're as good as athletes as the players are now. And they should be respected like that.
Absolutely. Sorry, Steve.
So yeah, I was going to just move on then to one of the points Chris made about the referees is described them paralysed as fear in relation to the second test. We have the description in the decision of Nick Berry saying that Rassie had engaged in a character assassination of him and his reputation as a referee and person will be tarnished forever. And then we had the situation yesterday with the publication of the RFU and Anthony Watson decision for comments on social media, which included a quote from a letter from Mike Priestley on behalf of the Rugby Football Referees Union and Dr. Tim Miller, noting the shortage of referees in the game and the feeling that many are leaving the game in part because of the persistent challenges of the decisions and the abuse that is now seeping into the game. Matt, do you see that as a real concern from situations like this and the trend that possibly is coming into the game?
I think it's just a fact, Steve, that what the community game sees on TV tends to cascade down. When I was coming through the junior ranks, what I saw on the Six Nations or the Premiership on a Friday night, I can guarantee you, by 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon the following day, there were 30 experts on the field about what happened the night before and the way I had to referee it the next day. And from my perspective, there are two consequences for how it kind of seeps down. I think, I don't think we would be surprised if a statistical analysis showed a correlation between increases in abuse or this kind of commentary about referees and referees leaving the game or not joining the game. The other element is the unseen chilling effect that people who might want to get into refereeing, want to get into officiating, just don't do so because it's not seen as being attractive. And that's really where the stakes for the game can actually end up being quite high, because the old adage is we don't have a game, we don't have a referee, we don't have a game. But what that actually means at community level, if we don't have a referee, then there are 30 players, females, males, or players, age grade players who aren't participating in the game. And wherever you fall on the side of this issue, we want participation in rugby. We want rugby to grow, and that's one of the dangers of this conduct potentially cascading down to other levels.
Chris, I can see you nodding. Is there anything you want to say in relation to that?
I mean, just a couple of things. I think that the danger is by the head of and the figurehead of an organization putting his cards on the table and saying we lost this match because of the referee, unfortunately then does enable a whole swathe of supporters to feel going forward that if the Springboks were to lose again, well, it's because of the referee. And I think that's extremely dangerous if the focus always becomes about the referee. And I've refereed a fair bit at grassroots level a while ago, and what you understand is that everyone is seeing it through the prism of their own team. And I was at AFC Wimbledon against Crewe last night, and the linesman near us got a load of stick, and he didn't make a wrong decision. I was watching as a neutral, and I see he got everything absolutely bang on. But when whether you are supporting the Springboks or the Lions, or whether you're supporting your local team, often on the sidelines, you are just seeing that through a biased prism of your own team and decisions going against your team. And people do have to just have that, maybe not at the front of their minds when they're watching, because we all want to get involved and support our team, but just remember that the referee is probably one of the few people in that whole environment who is coming at it strictly neutral.
Steve, do DOR see themselves as role models?
Well, I think we are role models, and unfortunately we are human, so we don't do everything right all the time. But I think we've got a duty to the game, the positions we get. There's only 12 directors of rugby in England, for example. The jobs are few and far between, and there's a lot of pressure on winning games, but there's also a lot of pressure of duty of care behind the scenes, and part of that is a duty to the game, not just the people who work for you. I think there's there's an element that we want characters in the game, and sometimes I've been described as one of them, but equally so, we have to do what's best 95% of the time. And going back to a little point what Chris made a minute ago, I can count on one hand per season. I can count on probably one finger really per season when a referee costs you a game by a poor decision. But I can tell you numerous occasions where we lose games by people dropping the ball when they're 5 meters out from the line, or they've given a penalty away when they don't need to give a penalty away. So we've got to have some equilibrium here and look at it. Referees are part of the game. It's not them and us. They are part of what we're about, from grassroots right the way up. On a Sunday morning, it'll be somebody's dad who's been on a night out who's refereeing the under-10s. And that's what we love about rugby. And that comes right the way through. This gang of referees that are coming. I know Barnes I wouldn't say he's coming to the end now, but he comes from a law background. Whatever he does, he's been a great ambassador for the sport, as much as any of the players have been an ambassador for the sport. So the role model tag comes across with everything we do, from players to coaches to referees, and sadly on this occasion, Rassie has not lived up to that mantle, but it is an error.
Ben, while we've touched on the Anthony Watson point, one of the questions was that in light of the 1 week suspension that he received, when actually the RFU had asked for a fine rather than a suspension, but the panel decided that that was not sufficient. The question is from Dyfrig, do you think that Rassie's precedence in the matter has an influence on that decision and the influence going forward?
I mean, I'm sure that the decision's going to have an influence going forward. I'm sure it's going to be cited by rugby judicial panels, for a long time to come. I'm not sure that it's, was considered in this case. I'm not sure exactly when the hearing was, but it may well not have been before the decision had come out. But I think it's clear that rugby's authorities are trying to do more about abuse and disrespect of match officials. Whether or not the Anthony Watson one is the most serious case, we'll see. I highly doubt. It was related to a tweet that was put out, sort of saying that a particular decision in the game was absurd. I think one could take differing views on how serious that was, perhaps. But it's clear from that decision, having had a quick read, that the RFU this season are keen to take steps to stamp out abusive match officials, having recognised, I think, last season that it was becoming more prevalent. And that actually relates to another question we've had in, someone anonymous, and they sort of refer to the fact that referee criticism is perhaps increasing, and they ask what can World Rugby do about it? And perhaps I would broaden the question to the panel. What should be done about this increase in sort of dissent towards officials, both on the pitch perhaps and also away from it? Who wants to take that one?
Well, if I can start, I think that one of the points that, picking up what Steve said about under 10s dads refereeing. Now, I'm an under 6s coach, but I have to do a referees course so that I understand what's doing it. I think that those involved around the game should be encouraged to, coaching, whatever, parenting, do the referees course to see how hard it is and to understand that thing, because there has to be a culture that the referee is sacrosanct. I know the first thing they said to me on the referees course, and to Matt said this earlier, you can't play without a referee. You can have a game of football without a referee. You can't have a game of rugby. If there's going to be abuse, the referee can just walk off and that's the end of the game. So I think there just needs to be that cultural understanding, which I've always thought rugby had, and maybe there is a slippage from that, and we need to reinforce the pedestal that the referees were put on.
I just want to pick up on, I don't know if you've seen in the chat, Steve, some comments made by Ross Tucker, kind of developing the point you made, and the impact of cognitive biases, cultural understandings and stereotypes in the way in which we perceive and understand these situations arising. I'm not saying that is an excuse or defense, but I think it raises a really interesting perspective about how we are viewing these incidents, and it justifies a need for panels who are sitting on these kind of cases, to be diverse and to reflect the makeup of the bodies and the organisations, the unions that form part of World Rugby.
I just think, I think that's just on that. I think that's extremely valid point, because in the last 18 months, I think everyone has been looking to explore their unconscious bias and to what point it exists. And I'm absolutely sure referees would be no different, like everyone else in the workplaces has been trying to do that. Because I know there was some unrest. Was it maybe the Georgia captain? Forgive me if I'm wrong, was pretty vocal about how they are being perceived compared to, say, the French team, given one is a tier 1 team, one's a tier 2 team, one is expected to win, one isn't. Is that impacting on decision making because, you're going to give the rub of the green to this player because he's won 80 caps and played in a World Cup final? This player's bound to have committed the offence because you've never heard of them. And I think that's all something that the referees are grappling with. And you have seen referees, for example, try and improve their communication skills when it comes to both teams. There has been an issue, hasn't there, with referees speaking in one language, which one team can really understand and one team can't. And so I think that is all points to definitely take forward. I think two issues as well about just the perception of referees in the game. One is at grassroots level. it's a really technical game, rugby union. It's not like football where really a foul is a foul. A lot of the time a foul is a foul and then you get the flash points. This is every ruck, every breakdown, one referee, offside lines going on behind their backs, lots of things happening that people from the sidelines can maybe see, the referee can't. But if people on the sidelines at grassroots level probably just need that awareness that it is a very technical, subjective game to officiate a lot of the time. And I think at the higher level, and Steve can certainly correct me if I'm wrong here, but coaches have become so technical and taken their analysis to the next level, as have players. The standards of coaching are going up and up and up. But there are a couple of things the referees can't really control. And one is the weather on any given day, and one is the referee. And you can plan for a bad weather day and pick a second kicker or whatever. You can plan for a referee that gives leniency in one area at the breakdown or whatever. But once the game has started, coaches don't have that control on certain factors. I just wonder if some coaches find that a bit difficult, knowing that they can plan all week and then suddenly out of their control are officials and the weather, and that can sometimes lead to outcomes they've not planned for.
Yeah, and I think by and large, if I'm being really honest, and I've blamed the weather and the referee many times, don't get me wrong, but it's an excuse mentality that is inbuilt. That's what happens. Georgia, for example, we used before, and we won't dwell too much on Georgia, but I coached the Russian team for 3 years, and the Russian team never beat Georgia in them 3 years because they were expected to lose. Never once did they blame the referee. Now, if we were to spin that on its head and go, Georgia want to go in the Six Nations, do we demote Italy? Put them two sides together 10 times and Italy would win 9 out of 10. Fact, as a coach, looking at that. So what we've got to remember is the adage Steve said about the under 6 referee on a Sunday morning, to whether it's Wayne Barnes or Luke Pearce, an international game. There's a code of conduct. I've broken it 2 or 3 times in my life. I'm not proud of that effect. But there's a code of conduct that if we don't abide by it, and Rassie hasn't, then we've got anarchy. We're in a state of flux. So let's get back to these basics. We want World Rugby. They've done a judgment. They're going to repeal it, obviously. But what has to come out of this is we, at the top of the professional game, what everybody watches, which permeates down to the grassroots, cannot behave like this. And if you do, this is what happens to you. And I think if you're prepared to do what Rassie's done, he's also got to be prepared to take the sanction. And, you know, we'll see where they go after the appeal.
I think that's probably a nice point to sort of segue on to talking about the sanction then. I suppose what's the panel's view on the severity of the sanction, on the length of it, on the way it's been put? Chris, have you got a view on that?
Not especially, because it's pretty unprecedented. Well, it's extremely unprecedented, this, isn't it? So the precedents they used were examples of cases involving coaches and referee disrespect, but aren't comparable. A lot of them were sort of heat of the moment, post-match ranting, as opposed to what has happened here, which is a calculated dissection of not just Berry's officiating, but also his conduct on the field. And when you ally that with what was going on off the field, with the threats Erasmus made, which have been proven, then I don't see how there can be too many complaints about the severity of the ban. Clearly, there's a lot of unease about how long the whole process took, and this might be one for the legal guys here. But what I'm told is that, you know, you've got to get people together. They've got other work on, time zones, but also the fact that they needed lots of submissions. It's not just the video to go through; it's submissions of other things that happen on behind the scenes. And look, it was very rugby for it to drop in the week of England South Africa. That just sort of sums up sometimes how things work with rugby politics. But, you know, certainly the explanation from the World Rugby side is that it took as long as it took because there was so much detail to get through and so many logistics to work through. As for whether Erasmus should be banned for time or whether he should be banned for matches, he's not going to miss too many games in terms of the match day now because the box season's over. But to not be in his next 2 months, he's only going to miss that one game in terms of his 2-month ban, but then obviously his 10-month on match days will impact him in the championship next year, but not as much as if the hearing had come out earlier. But I don't know. I think the reaction seems, the outcome seems harsh enough to make a lesson of Erasmus, but certainly not draconian enough to, to say that he can't coach again. So I think the right balance may well have been struck.
And Steve Diamond, have you got a reaction to that?
Well, again, I had a good read of the judgment, and I in all honesty, I'd not paid too much attention to it, being out of the game for a short period of time. But he's been found guilty of threatening a match official, hasn't he? In a premeditated, sustained attack. It wasn't a post-match reaction like most of us do in those positions under pressure. So I think it's, the punishment does fit the crime. It's a significant punishment, 2 months away from all activity, and a match day ban up until whenever, August, September 22. He won't miss too many games. But I think I've been dealt time punishments before. I was banned for 14, 16 weeks, banned from the stadium, and it has a massive effect. And you learn, and I've learned why. When Steve Flynn asked me to come on this, I was delighted to join you people, because I've learned, and I learned the hard way. And if I can put something across to up and coming coaches and directors of rugby, then that's what I'll do. So, he's got what he's given, and he'll have to stomach it, hopefully, and he'll come back an even better coach. And you can't get much better than winning a Lions series and winning a World Cup. So I think it fits the crime.
Thanks, Steve. And Matthew, have you got a view on the way that perhaps sanctioning was approached?
Look, the panel consisted of 3 eminent lawyers with their own rugby experience. They've attended World Cups, attended other major competitions, and I think the fact that you've got that experience on the panel helps measure the reasonableness of the decision. But look, you look at the facts the committee found, really serious conduct, as Steve's identified. It's difficult to know what we're measuring it against, because as the panel identified in their decision, it's helpful. So it's interesting to look at other decisions, but often they don't add very much, and that was the case for the ones that were cited there. And I'm interested to see if it's going to be argued that this sanction was, excessive. What the grounds are, because these experienced judicial officers arrived at a decision that seems within the ambit of their power on the facts they found.
Just going to the point then that Chris made about the delay, obviously more of a lawyer's point. As Chris pointed out, it wasn't just the video that was relied upon. There was a dispute over the facts as to what had been said between Erasmus and Nick Berry prior to the release of the video. And there were also legal challenges to the standard of liability that were going to apply to South Africa. So these were complicated factual and legal matters that needed to be considered properly. And I've certainly read some public comments from ex-players saying, well, if I'd done something on the Saturday, I'd be up in front of the disciplinary panel on the Tuesday. That's right, because the evidence is all there and the mechanisms and the legal system is all set up to deal with that. This was much more complicated. And what I would say as somebody who represents players and clubs regularly is be careful what you wish for. If you want to raise substantive defences, you want them to be considered properly and to give the opportunity for those to be properly ventilated. If you're told suddenly you've got to get them done within 3 days, you're not going to get the fair hearing you want. So in such a high profile matter, I think it was inevitable that it was going to take time. It wasn't going to be dealt with within the British and Irish Lions series. And the delay, as is set out in the judgment, was because those matters were being considered. Yes, in an on-field matter, things should be dealt with quickly so it doesn't impact the following match. But I don't think that applies in situations like this.
I think if also I could just add to that, Steve, because I completely echo your thoughts, is that the sanction was always likely to be a severe one. Certainly that was what World Rugby were asking for, and therefore it's even more important for the proper time to be taken to ensure the fairness of the proceedings. From a coach's or player's perspective, what you want more than anything is for the process to be fair, and that has to take priority over reaching a quick decision. Matthew, I'd be interested to get your take on it from the sort of case management perspective, given that that's something that I imagine that you have to deal with in your role as sort of a panel chair relatively regularly.
I think we should also just recognise how the panel themselves define the delay. I think they describe it as perceived delay, because I actually think this was just down to practical issues. You're dealing with judicial officers who are on 3 continents. You've got match officials who themselves are across the world, and you're trying to align diaries. So I suspect the reason for that perceived delay was not only to ensure the fair process, but also to ensure everyone could participate. I think Steve's probably right. When it comes to an on-field incident, you've got the footage usually within hours after the incident. The player's done a statement, and you're usually ready to go the next few days. This was clearly a complicated matter. A number of important defences were raised, and they needed to be articulated fully and carefully. And I think if you were a participant in that process, you'd rather the committee deal with it fairly than sacrifice that fairness on the altar of expediency.
And that's absolutely right. I suppose another interesting point that came out of the decision was the role of SA Rugby, and perhaps their standoffishness in relation to what Erasmus did. Did the panel have any view on sort of the union's role, Chris? I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, look, in international rugby union, there are some enormous personalities heading up their rugby programs, aren't there? If you look at the global game, there are big hitters of plenty who have a huge amount of influence, not just on the team they're coaching, i.e. the men's senior team, but also on the whole face of their union and the whole face of rugby in that particular country. And Erasmus is certainly an example of someone who, given what he did from 2018 to 2019, is rightfully seen as a South African rugby hero. But with that, perhaps comes a feeling he can do little wrong. I would like to think that if it was a union, say the RFU, and despite the fact that we all know Eddie Jones wields a lot of influence at Twickenham, that's a fairly obvious thing to say. I would like to think that if Jones had done this, he may not have got as far because he'd have been stopped by his union before the video got out, or if the video had got out, I do think I would have faith that the RFU, while perhaps trying to defend Jones as their blue ribband employee, would also accept that he had crossed the line and brought the game into disrepute. So I think South African Rugby Union have taken the view to back Erasmus to the hilt, whereas another union would have gone, yes, we absolutely respect everything this guy has done, and he will forever be an important figure, and he is our number one employee. However, in this situation, we need to reprimand him. And I think other unions would have handled it in a different way to Saru.
It'd be interesting to know whether, if it'd been dealt with in a different way, whether there would have been consequences for the union had they approached it differently with World Rugby.
That's the point. They were found to be strictly liable from a legal perspective for what he had done, but the punishment, if they'd have chastised him, would have probably been, as you say, nothing. Whereas because they didn't deal with it, they ended up being punished.
Certainly, that's my view. I would think that they probably wouldn't even have been charged had, and Erasmus may not even have been charged by World Rugby had he been charged by his own union under their, under the auspices of their disciplinary jurisdiction. And yes, although it's a strict liability offence, you would think that sort of any potential breach of the regulations on the part of the union would be effectively remedied by them taking enforcement action of their own, because that would show them upholding the regulations. That's certainly my view, but perhaps a slightly more technical point. I think Steve Diamond, you may have to dash off now. Is that right?
Yeah. The last part on that point, though, before I go,
please.
The Saru and Rassie neither apologised, did they? The problem with this case is they both know the system. Saru knows World Rugby's code of conduct, and Rassie knows it. So it was an act of ignorance, really. So if you know what the code of conduct is and you go against it, Well, they put themselves in a corner, which for some reason, you know, Rassie's a very good coach, world-class coach, but there's got to be an infrastructure behind you, a support mechanism that can support him, as Chris discussed, you hopefully have at the RFU. Where that support mechanism's gone, I don't know. But it certainly didn't assist Rassie in any of this.
Unfortunate. As Ben said, Steve, if you need to drop out at any stage, there'll be no offence. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, gents.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Nice to see you, Steve.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've just got a few more things that, well, a couple more things we'd like to discuss, and then we'll deal with some of the questions that have been coming through. We've been trying to sort of answer as many as we can as we go, and I think we have, but there will be a few more. I suppose the main point really left for us to deal with is the appeal. Perhaps a slightly more legal question, although I think it's interesting that they've appealed, you know, given this sort of non-apologetic and stance they've taken. Chris, what's your take on the fact that this is sort of going to drag out longer, and then perhaps we can deal with the slightly more legal aspects of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have lost a bit of the energy for it. There was some kind of closure, we all thought, the other day. And look, we can't get inside Sari's head, we can't get inside Erasmus's head, and clearly they're confident that Erasmus was raising some extremely valid points, and they would perhaps point to the fact that a fair few of his gripes came back with Nick Berry agreeing with some of his interpretations of the various incidents, although clearly we know that if you went through any game of rugby, you could find countless incidents that could have been seen one way or the other. So again, that falls into this kind of subjectivity and the acceptance of how a game of rugby is full of these variables. But no, look, it would have been great to draw it from a sort of narrative media point of view, just to draw a line under it. Erasmus didn't get to coach his team at Twickenham. He has to take his 2 months medicine. He then will have to be away from match day, which, as Steve outlined, will really hurt, given how important he is to that setup. The lawyers amongst us will be able to probably talk about how likely an appeal is to be successful. But given you've got those three experienced figures going through over the course of months, an 80-page document proving 6 charges, proving 1 on Sari's case, disproving another, or throwing out another, it seems like a fairly forensic process to try and overturn. So it feels unfortunate for the game that this incident, which has been a cloud, is going to drag out further. And I think a lot of neutrals would have just gone, look, let's draw a line, let's park it, and let's try and consign it to history, while trying, of course, to learn the lessons from it.
Steve, anything to add?
I suppose when the main line of appeal, I suspect, in relation to sanction. And so what the panel would be looking to when they were sanctioning was the least severe penalty reasonably possible, which would sanction the offender whilst also adequately protecting the wider needs, structures and values of the game. So it's those two things are being played into. And my view is that this falls squarely in that view, prospect, in that category. And I took a view initially that it was probably on the lower side of what I'd expected, having read the decision. I know that others have said it's actually at the higher end of it, but it's certainly within that margin of appreciation that's afforded to disciplinary panels, and I'd be surprised if it got anywhere on appeal.
Yeah, I think that point about the margin of appreciation is an important one, because the way that rugby disciplinary appeals work is that it's an appeal by way of review on sort of quite limited grounds. It's not just a rehash of the whole case. It's a review of the decision that was taken, and ultimately it's a question of whether it was reasonable, put simply, and that's quite a high threshold. Panels are given this significant margin of appreciation that you refer to, and that's been clear from previous appeals that have happened. I'm thinking of the one that involves Spain and Romania over the eligibility for the last World Cup. That made that very clear, and so it is intrinsically a hard thing to do to overturn these decisions. I think you're right that any appeal would probably focus on the sanctioning element, although we don't know necessarily all facts in the background that may give rise to other potential grounds of appeal. I suppose arguments might be made that it's too harsh, that a 2-month ban from effectively doing his job. He's essentially not able to do any of his role at SARU is quite extreme, but then the conduct was unprecedented. Earlier it was mentioned that he won't miss many matches as a result of the ban, but actually when you factor in the fact that he's SA Rugby's director of rugby, not just the Springboks of a head coach, there are a number of other fixtures, including the SA women's team and the slightly, the more junior teams that will be affected. So there are quite a lot of matches in there too. I think you're right that it feels like it's within that margin of appreciation. Some might feel it's too harsh, some might feel it's too lenient, but that's not the test ultimately. What one point that may be slightly more arguable, I feel, is on the SA Rugby side, because the panel referred to the Lions Tour 2009, where the union was sanctioned for an incident involving the players protesting publicly a decision of a disciplinary committee, and they were sanctioned for that and fined £10,000. And that was used as an aggravating factor in assessing the seriousness of their misconduct. And I wonder whether an argument might be raised that perhaps that shouldn't have been an aggravating factor, given how long ago it was, given how much time and how much rugby has elapsed in between, and that perhaps it only should have sort of reduced the amount of mitigation available, and therefore perhaps £25,000 is excessive. However, I still can't see it being reduced significantly if it is at all. I don't know if you had any further thoughts, Matthew.
Well, maybe Chris can help me with this. I think I might have read in the South African press in the last few days that the sanction was one that was lower than the World Rugby was seeking. And I'm wondering whether you've heard anything about World Rugby seeking to challenge the sanction.
No, I definitely haven't heard they will be challenging the sanction. World Rugby, and part of the reason, I suppose, the communication hasn't been hugely forthcoming throughout this whole issue is because I think World Rugby have been at pains to try and point out the independence of the process. Yes, they brought the charge, and yes, they put the committee together. And I'm sure there are people in South Africa who would say, well, look, the people on the committee are all from countries that are going to, that don't like the Springboks, and sort of feed that conspiracy that we've touched upon a little bit earlier. And I'm sure there'll be gripes about the process from South Africa, but World Rugby have been very keen to point out that it's an independent process and that they only received the judgment minutes or hours before it was made public. So it's not as if World Rugby are able to shape the judgment or shape the outcome. And I personally haven't heard that, from speaking to people at World Rugby, I think they want to draw a line under it, and they are happy and comfortable with the process, the independence of it, and the time it was taken to get a reasonable outcome. So yeah, I wouldn't be able to say that there'll be too many repercussions or much fallout from sort of the World Rugby side of things.
I also would add that although World Rugby was seeking a longer ban in terms of matches, I think the panel sort of played around with the sanction and arrived at one that they felt fitted the crime more appropriately, with this sort of more general ban from all rugby activity. So when considered sort of globally, I'm not sure that the sanction is necessarily less severe than that World Rugby were proposing. And with that in mind, my view is that it would be a surprise if they were to go to the lengths that would be required to appeal, bearing in mind the standard of review would be the same if they were to appeal it, of course. So would be slightly surprising, I think. Steve, were there any questions that had come in from the attendees that you wanted to address before we wrap up?
I think there was a couple of technical ones about where the appeal goes and whether the appeal is extended if the appeal fails. I think that the ban is ongoing now. The appeal process doesn't stop that, so it shouldn't impact that. And in terms of where things go for the appeal, that is to the appeal committee of World Rugby. And if you do read the decision, you'll see the direction at Appendix 1 that Chris Quinlan, who was chairing the panel and who's the chair of the Judicial Committee for World Rugby, actually appointed Adam Castleton SC to deal with the appeal. So there is a mechanism within rugby to deal with it, rather than it going to the Court of Arbitration for Sport or the Swiss Federal Tribunal, which is one of the questions.
I suppose if that decision of the appeal committee was to be challenged, there might be the prospect of the English courts, given that that's the jurisdiction that World Rugby selects to have sort of overall authority. What I mean by that is that they don't provide for further appeals to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, for example, unlike in other sports. But again, I think the prospect of that is quite unlikely. Although that said, given the approach that SA Rugby and Erasmus have taken to date, maybe nothing's off the cards.
The one other point which I think is worth just touching on before we let everybody go was Rassie Erasmus asked for it to be held in public, and that was refused on the basis that it was observed that it might be in public, but it's not in secret, because the decision was going to be published and everyone would understand the rationale. I suppose my view, and Chris, I'd be interested in yours, is I suspect there'd be very little interest in anybody sitting down to watch these things. They'd be very dry, in my experience. Maybe the first one, but
I think the concept probably is a little bit sexier than the reality of it. I think if it could be thrashed out in a 20-minute debate, then yeah, brilliant, bring it on. But I think a forensic, days and days and perhaps weeks of poring over evidence might not get the ratings through the roof.
Do you think it wouldn't capture the South African press?
I suppose it's tricky when we're dealing with issues, in something like rugby, where you see 80 minutes and everything's over, and then in your legal world where things take a lot of time and there's a real sort of forensic level of detail required in these cases. So yeah, while I think it would be good fun to have seen some of it, I think to get to the process thorough and detailed, I'm sure you guys would agree that it's best done in a more procedural way.
No broadcast deal coming for World Rugby and their lawyers just yet, then?
I think what I view is the not informality of the process, but there is a way that these things take place where there is a recognition of what's going on, and they aren't in the way that court proceedings are uber formal. They're much more of a reflection that everyone is a participant in the game. We're all working for the better of the game. Well, we might be disagreeing on these kind of disputes and misconduct, and I think that it could, if it was made public, feed into a perception of why weren't you being harder, or why were you taking that line and not the other. I think it would just create more problems than it would, and I imagine it would put referees off even further if they were the idea that they were going to be publicly cross-examined on a Tuesday evening for a red card that they gave.
I agree,
and that's what the panel identified in this case, that you can achieve accountability in your decision making and transparency by other means than broadcasting. And it's not as though the way in which the panel's approached it has inhibited the conversation, the debate that's taking place.
Right, then we've gone over time slightly, so I think it's time to draw matters to an end. Thank you, Matt, Chris, and Ben, and also Steve, before he went, for joining Ben and I to discuss about these things. We're very grateful. It's been a fascinating hour or so. To those who are listening to the recording, they've done so for free, which has allowed us not to charge for this event. And we hope you found it useful and informative. And if you have, we'd encourage you to make a reflective donation to your local rugby club. They've all gone through a hard time with COVID and things like that. A few quid here and there would very much help that. And we would invite that as a way of expressing the benefit you've had for that. In terms of this event, it was a follow-on from last year's rugby conference that Ben and I organised with our respective chambers and employers. We plan to run another event in the new year, so we'll keep you informed about that. Hopefully that will be in person, COVID depending. If you want to keep up to date on our future plans, then Ben is at Rugby and the Law on Twitter, and I think the same on Instagram, and also his name on those platforms. I'm Steve Flynn Barr. You've obviously found out about this through somewhere, so hopefully we'll keep you informed about those events, and we'll be able to have a few beers or coffees to in person and discuss the fallout of the appeal by then. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.
Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve.